Yeah, this is so important that there's a lot of people out there trying to monetize it. There's a lot of people who are trying to use your emotions and your emotional needs to sell more stuff to you and to distract you from what you really want and need.
I gotta tell you, I am really excited for this conversation today.
Oh, good. Me too.
Yes, good. So, well, thank you for being here. Like I said, I'm pumped to have this conversation. I didn't necessarily, how do I want to say this? I didn't have the same level of enthusiasm necessarily, and that's not a knock on you. When I first, booked this and scheduled this interview, but what had happened in between was I actually had this idea to develop something that I called the big brain. And I'll get into that in a little bit,
Yeah.
but as I started to think about that, and as I started to think about our conversation this morning, I realized there's probably a lot that we can talk about here in understanding the way that people think, the emotions, the rationality. And kind of before we get into that, I'd love if you could just give us a brief rundown of like what you built with the Agile mind there, and how all of that really works. I would love a little bit of background on that if you could kind of start us
Yeah,
off there.
absolutely. So, well, my background is in social psychology, and I like to tell people I got my degree at a time when it was the height of the cognitive revolution. So everything was information processing based. There's sort of a computer metaphor for how we make decisions and how how our minds work. And I didn't buy that. I knew emotions played a much more, much stronger role in my life. And I found a group of sort of renegades, who believed the same thing. And we were not too popular. I ended up doing my research over in a different building, not in the psychology building, because I was interested in like psychophysiological response and emotions and people's emotion perception and that sort of thing. And back in the psych building, they were teaching things like the way we develop an attitude is you calculate mentally the importance of the this dimension and you multiply it by its positive versus negative consequences. Then you do this summative additive thing like we're like Excel sheets in our brains. And I wasn't buying any of that. And the beauty is, in the intervening years and decades, our side has been vindicated. We've had since fMRIs was invented and became sort of mainstream, the invention of behavioral economics. Daniel Kahneman winning the Nobel Prize for that. The basic idea that we are not these sort of rational information processing beings. We are essentially emotional beings who have a kind of a gloss of rationality, which we can use to kind of explain things to ourselves and others. But what we really do and why we do it is because of our emotions and our emotional needs. And I love that about Abraham Maslow's model. The problem I had back then was that there were so many mini theories of why people do what they do. It seemed like every time somebody needed to publish a book or and since then, right, have a TED talk or something, there's another, it all comes down to this. It all comes down to, willpower, or it comes down to grit, or it comes down to, whatever, insert your favorite term there. Maslow had his 5 layer cake of needs, but people who looked at work, like McClelland, focused on things like a need for achievement, need for power, and there were all these needs coming from. And what there was missing was a kind of a comprehensive model to explain all the needs, like every possible human need based on first principles, that where we could contextualize this and say, okay, now we've actually described them all. And all of the other ones that have been proposed actually fit into this matrix. And that's what I set out to do, and that's what I did. So it was a kind of a big deal. Took a long time to get it published because I venture into the spiritual domain. And the spiritual domain, I think until very recently, was taboo in academic psychology. And again, just the way I couldn't ignore the importance of emotions, I couldn't deny the importance of the spiritual domain of our lives in driving our behavior. When we think about the extreme behaviors, probably the most extreme behaviors that people undertake as humans, largely those come from spiritual beliefs of one kind or another. The fight for justice, standing up for ethics, a higher purpose, transcendence, becoming one with the divine. Those are the things that drive really intense behavior. And any treatment in psychology that doesn't address that, I think, is missing out, on most of the story. So Anyway, that's sort of how I got to where I am.
Yeah, I love that, and I love your vigor for the topic because it's not just, hey, let me accept what it is. Like there is a better way that you can see the path forward, and you're going to do what you can to take that path, which is awesome. And I think a lot of people don't necessarily go out on that limb. It's a difficult place to put yourself, right? Because you're going to get a lot of criticism, and especially
Yeah.
when you're doing something no one else has done, it sets you up for a tremendous amount of judgment. And is that something that you had to deal with?
Absolutely. I mean, I feel like I've spent my whole career out on a limb, metaphorically, in that that's exactly right. I kind of know what I believe, and I think it's right, and I can sort of prove it, and I publish a lot, empirically and theoretically, to kind of put the ideas out there to let them be available for scrutiny. And I welcome that. And the one thing that the sort of reaction that I dislike the most is sort of people just silence, you've done this thing, you've created this model, it works, it explains behavior, it does so pretty dramatically. And yet, if you have a vested interest in a different model, if you have a vested interest in a more constrained sort of view of human nature, especially if you make money from that, you have a vested interest in not paying attention to these ideas. So that's been a frustration of mine. I mean, fortunately, I got the book published a couple of months ago, The Emotionally Agile Brain. It's available on Amazon, and it kind of summarizes all of this stuff, puts it out there. And fortunately, I've been publishing like mad, like probably four or so peer-reviewed articles a year, and it's getting the ideas out there. When you bump up against is people's vested interests. And I
Yeah.
particularly ran into that in the leadership world. Apparently there's a lot of money that's made in leadership effectiveness, and they have, they want to protect that space.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate because it often comes down to the point where you're not necessarily putting forth the best interest of your client or your customer or whoever you're working with, because you might necessarily have to protect your opinion or your point of view because that's what makes you the most money. And if you say, hey, there might be a better way, now all of a sudden you don't have anything to gatekeep and there's no reason to pay you anymore, right?
Exactly, exactly, and that's what I've encountered, and because I think what I've put out there is kind of shocking when you think about its implications. I like to use the example of like the Plinko game, where the little balls drop down and they get sorted into little buckets. And I've created those buckets. These buckets are these 12 emotional needs that I've identified. And again, I didn't identify any of them. All I did is sort of describe the structure that holds them together, and showed that by kind of using that structure, we can claim that this is a comprehensive model. But the shocking thing is that if you go one field after another and take their problems of theory, and you just take all their concepts and dump them in the top of the funnel, they end up sorting into these same 12 every single time. I did it with the concept of human values. I did it with the concept of human goals. I did it with organizational culture. I did it with leadership effectiveness, team emergent states, and on and on. Even the concept of subjective well-being itself is composed of these 12 concepts. And I don't think it's an accident that it applies to so many different fields so well. It's because fundamentally, when you strip away any one of those ideas, really what you're talking about is the fulfillment of people's emotional needs. If I have a culture which meets my emotional needs and those are the employees, it's going to feel healthy. If it doesn't, it prioritizes certain things over others, it's going to feel toxic. If I have leadership that works to fulfill the needs of customers and employees, that's going to be effective leadership. If it's sort of selfish and unbalanced, it's not going to be effective. Same thing in teams. Same thing when it comes to values. Same thing when it comes to goals. These are ultimately what we're after. And for some reason, in academia over the years, we've kind of generated all of these words to describe basically the same thing. But they end up with, again, they build up, journals around them and conferences around them and books and concepts. And then they want to protect those things. When the reality is actually, I think, pretty simple.
Yeah. So do I understand this correctly that like every argument or principle or conversation can be, again, when you drop it in the top of the Plinko game here, they're all going to fall into these 12 buckets.
Yeah.
The question becomes how much falls into which of those buckets. Is that where
Exactly.
the personal belief system comes in, where like for me, I may need more things in bucket number 4 than bucket number 3, but for you,
Exactly.
your priority is bucket number 6. Is that,
Yeah,
am I
exactly.
right?
That's exactly right. So basically, the way to look at it is every single person who has ever existed or ever will exist, unless we have some change in our, evolution that changes this, uh, has these 12 needs, right? We have these, the basic structure of the model is sort of asking two questions about change, right? I want to change from one situation to another. The first question is, where do I want to make that change? Do I want to make that change within myself? Or do I want to make that change in the world of my relationships with other people? So self versus other. Do I want to make that change in the material world of work and play and money and things, or in the spiritual world of ideas and concepts, the immaterial, right? So that's the first question. The next question is we borrowed from Aristotle, which is what stage of development is it? Is it sort of being, doing, or having? Is it sort of a state of just pure potential? Is it a state of becoming, or is it a state of a kind of actualization? And he had a great example of a pile of lumber. Home Depot comes, you're going to do a project, and they dump up with all these 2x4s in front of your house. At that point, it could be turned into a shed, it could be turned into a bridge, it could be turned into a lot of different things. It's in a state of pure potential. Once you have a design and an architect and a builder, and they start putting the thing together, now it's becoming, right? And then eventually you have, let's say, a shed, and it's finished, and you can put your lawnmower in it and lock the door. That's a state of actualization. So you take those three levels of development and you cross them by those four areas of life, the four domains of life, self, material, social, spiritual. And lo and behold, you've got 12 boxes, and that's it. There's nothing else that can possibly exist as a kind of a need. And every one of the needs that have been identified, and there's more than 100 of these things in the literature, they all have a home in there. So you have Maslow's hierarchy of needs, sort of need for safety, need for belonging, need for love, need for esteem, need for self-actualization. They have one, section of it, all the stuff that Kohlberg and Piaget and Paul Bloom and Adele and Joshua Green at Harvard have been working on in terms of morality and looking at morality in the brain, in fMRI and these different sort of those trolley examples and what gets activated. That stuff all has a home there too. There's a need for justice. There's a need for ethics. There's a need for higher purpose. The beauty of it is that with this simple model, we're able to account for everything, not just in the field of emotional needs and motivations. We're also able to deal with all those other fields that I mentioned because they're all built on that implicitly. They never quite say that. They think, they've started from a different starting point, but they are indeed built on that same exact concept.
So you're basically taking those individual concepts that live sort of inside one of those buckets and zooming out to sort of capture the entire ecosystem as a whole,
Yes.
rather than just the microsystems. Is
Exactly.
that right?
And you, I'm sure, have encountered this where you'll have somebody whose pitch basically is, everything's about purpose. Ultimately, it's all about purpose, or ultimately it's really all about authenticity. It all boils down to personal authenticity. My philosophy is authenticity is extremely important. Purpose is extremely important, but those are two of 12 needs. They're all important. And if you don't have foundational needs, those sort of, the needs of potential that Aristotle, the pile of lumber, those are things like safety, autonomy, inclusion, justice. If you don't have those in place, you're not progressing upward to start thinking about authenticity and purpose. Like you're thinking more like revolution, you're thinking like
Right.
things are not right. And I can't, you have a very poor state of emotional well-being. And those things are priorities to be addressed. And that brings up the other kind of gloss on this, which is that every one of those 12 has two faces. It has the face of the pull and the push. The face of, I want more of the good. I want more feelings of I'm living in an ethical society, or I want to get rid of bad feelings. Like I want to get rid of the wrongdoing that's in society. I want to, strive for success materially. I want to avoid failure. And those are very different psychologically. I mean, that's one of the things Kahneman pointed out. He said, bad is stronger than good. If you have a big unmet need to get rid of bad, that's going to drive your behavior far more. It's much more urgent than striving for the good, the sort of, aspirations in those areas. So we measure with AgileBrain, we measure both sides of that coin. We measure, give equal treatment to all 12, equal treatment to all the positives and all the negatives. And the beauty of it is, I don't know if you've been exposed to this, but it's through an app that we have. It's an image-based exercise. It only takes 3 minutes. All you do is pick pictures, and then you see one every second, and you have no time to think, and you keep people off balance on purpose. And they have to respond with their emotions. They don't have time to think. And we have these incredibly powerful predictive models that come out of that. We're able to predict, whether or not people are going to quit their jobs with something like 80% accuracy off of this little 3-minute exercise.
Wow. So what that's doing is basically understanding the mix of where this person prioritizes those 12 buckets and how they prioritize the push and the pull of each one.
Exactly. And so back to that concept that everybody has all 12 of these needs. We all have these needs, but not all of them are unmet, right? If I think about a particular time in my life, if I think about right now, I've a couple of years from paying off my mortgage, so I'm not feeling quite as like financially insecure as I probably did, when I was starting out. So that need is there. It's just that I've mostly fulfilled that need, right? So it's not activated. On the other hand, I'm having a need for, I want people to accept my model, and so I have this need for recognition or authenticity, let's say, and those are becoming activated. So I've got sort of unmet needs in those areas. Those are going to then make those more salient. Those are going to drive my choices and my behavior. I'm going to look for opportunities to fulfill those needs. I may feel, that I have a great sense of autonomy. People let me pretty much do what I want to do. And so there it's a need, but it's met. I don't have an unmet need there, right? Immersion, like I love playing music. I love, going to concerts. If I can do that regularly, my need for immersion will be satisfied. I'm not going to feel like, I really need to, get into the flow with something because I have an opportunity for that. So you can look at it like every single person in every situation and at every time, in every context, is going to have a different profile of these needs. And those needs are going to change, as you get opportunities to do things, as you, experience life, those things are met or unmet, and that shift moves over time. And the general sort of shape of that shifting is as you develop as a person, you go from sort of the needs of the self, it's sort of egocentric needs, to sort of exploring the environment. This is like Piaget's stuff around, the child the exploration, you move from the self to the material. Then you begin to think about other people. Other people are not just an extension of you. They have their own, your theory of mind. They have their own thoughts and needs. And then eventually you extrapolate those things where you care about kin. You want to love other people and be loved. You begin to extend those things to people you don't know. And that's where you get into the spiritual domain. And you go from sort of caring and love, with kin to the extrapolation to people you don't know, which is ethics, right? And, the higher love being a sort of higher purpose, right? So there's that kind of movement from the left to the right, from the self, the material, to the social, to the spiritual. And then there's a progression upward, Aristotle's levels, right? From foundational needs, which tend to be deficiency needs. They tend to be more on the negative side. Like I feel insecure. I feel like I'm subjected to injustice. And then you move into the experiential needs, which are things like, the need for flow, the need for authenticity, the need for caring. Move up to the top, and that's the healthiest place to be, which is when you've met your lower needs. Now we're thinking about things like self-actualization. We call it, fulfilling your potential, material success, social recognition or esteem, respect, validation, and the sort of spiritual transcendence. So there's a lot of moving parts.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I think, that to me, it seems like the sort of thing where it becomes almost like your annual doctor physical. You maybe get a pulse of how big each one of those buckets are each year for yourself and understand, hey, which one do I need to prioritize right now? Which one, hey, man, that bucket is full. I can maybe put a cap on that bucket, make sure it doesn't leak.
Yep.
And make sure, hey, I got to focus on putting this bucket in the middle so it kind of collects the most coins.
Exactly. You got that exactly right. And the beautiful thing about this is that, this is a very light touch in terms of data collection. You can do this on your phone, you can do this on your computer, you can do it on a tablet. You can do it anywhere at any time. It only takes 3 minutes, and it basically doesn't use language. It only uses images. So we're doing this now. We're doing this in Ukraine and the school systems there in Kiev, where there's a lot of people who have recognized that even though a lot of students there won't raise their hand that they're having an emotional struggle, something like more than 80% are showing signs of having those kinds of, PTSD type of experiences. And this is something that they're using there with teachers, parents, students to kind of do this little quick, like, emotional dipstick and find out how's this person doing. And what people don't know when they take this is how strongly correlated these results are with clinical measures like the PHQ-9 and the GAD-7, which are sort of the standard clinical measures of depression, anxiety, loneliness, trauma, maladaptive coping, stress. Like, we've done the research. Basically, we can predict with something like 92% accuracy, whether somebody is depressed or not, just from their pattern of selecting pictures. So the secret sauce there is basically if you have far more negative needs than positive needs, like I want to get rid of these bad feelings, and that's overwhelmingly your profile versus I'm aspiring for more of the good, that's highly associated with bad sort of mental health. The other thing is the amount of images you pick. If you pick a ton of images, you're highly activated. It's an indicator of stress, and that can be good stress or bad stress. But when you put a high activation with a very heavy negative valence, a negative kind of orientation, that's associated with lots of issues. So it's a great, very economical way to kind of, light touch. We're not asking you any personal questions whatsoever, but it's highly predictive of all kinds of things.
I love that concept. And the interesting thing to me there, and I mean, we're sort of circling back to what interests me the most about this conversation, is one of the things I noticed in this current environment is if we talk about people who are looking to avoid the negative, right? And I'm looking at this from the perspective of news, right? Or quote unquote news. A lot of that is framed very hyperbolically in the terms of, hey, there's a lot of fluffy words to say this dramatic person did this dramatic thing, rather than just saying this person did this thing. It becomes sensationalized because that gets more attention,
Yeah.
right? And what I see happening, which is why I started down this path of study, is people then become attracted to more of that because it seems like there's this level of drama that is something that they need to pay attention to. There's this danger, and now they're looking for this danger, and they're going to see this danger more and more everywhere, and this danger becomes bigger in their mind than it really is, right? Because it becomes this sort of echo chamber for them. That's all they are thinking about. That's all that they see,
Yeah.
right? Do you see that same thing happening?
Absolutely. I think there's so much evidence now. It's sort of piling up, and it's impossible to miss. I don't know if you've read The Anxious Generation, the Jonathan Haidt book. It's basically he's sort of chronicling what happened to Gen Z. Like, why is it that we have this group that's so much higher in terms of anxiety, depression, all sorts of OCD, all kinds of sort of clinically observable, issues, things like suicide, like things that are not even like a matter of debate. It's like, either the person is alive or dead. We can prove that there's something going on with this generation. And he ties it back to the advent of social media and the sort of front facing camera, which is, you're constantly being judged. You're being judged 24/7, and I don't know if you've seen the new Netflix series, Adolescence. It's truly frightening about what it's sort of a picture of what it is like to be a middle schooler. This is in England, being sort of picked on indirectly, through social media posting and liking and everything else, and these sort of strange references that only they would understand, and how sort of cyberbullying has continued to exist. It's just it's sort of gone underground. And I can't imagine what it must be like to grow up like that right now. It's horrible. And that's the sort of background, right? That's what everybody is doing. They're on their phones 24 hours a day. That interferes with their sleep. You have all of that going on. Uh, and then that sort of leads to this general sort of coarsening of society where people are constantly freaked out. They're freaked out about, what's their public image? What's their, what are people saying about them? What are they missing out on? When I was in high school, I'm sure people did things without me. I just didn't know about it. I didn't see it.
Right.
It wasn't posted to everyone I know that they could all see that I wasn't there, and that's like the least of the what gets posted these days. Uh, I mean, I think that alone is a big contributor. But Haidt also talks about, in the 80s, sort of we were just coming out of the 70s, which is the height of like the serial killer phenomenon. In the 80s, that dropped. But what took its place was a lot of reporting, a lot of, Dateline, and 2020, and all of these sort of very sensationalized depictions of these terrible stories. And that led to, I remember when my kids were growing, this sort of pervasive feeling that your kids were unsafe, that you needed to watch them constantly and you needed to protect them. You didn't let them run around the neighborhood. You didn't, and that basically he shows that over time, there have been far less of these sort of, kinds of injuries that kids get from playing in the neighborhood because they're safely sitting in their rooms behind their computer or playing video games. And they're not getting that really important socialization. And you see these kids now who are basically barely communicative. Like the idea of being in person is incredibly stressful to them because they haven't been exposed to that because we were sort of told by media to protect them for at least 10 or 20 years, and beyond, and it's, yeah, I think it's exactly what you're talking about, that we've kind of created a social dynamic that is poisonous for mental health.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of issues with it. One of them that I see, especially right now, is that it, again, has created these echo chambers for people to live inside of, where now they're being fed more and more of the same thing, right? Whether it's algorithms or whether it's themselves looking for that type of reality because that's what they believe that they're going to see. And the main concern I have is it's not going to bring us to a good place, right? So the way that I see it playing out is, rather than talking about an issue, whatever the issue is, and there's plenty of them to pick from, but whatever the issue is, you and I, not necessarily you and I, but in this scenario, let's say you and I can't sit down and have a good, productive conversation on it because I'm so stuck in my echo chamber, you're so stuck in yours,
Yeah.
that's what we believe is the thing. And we've sort of developed this desire to make every conversation binary where it has to be right versus wrong.
Right.
And again, I'm not the expert here, but just from what I understand, so please correct me if I'm wrong, is we do this because it's easier for us to say, I'm a good guy, you're a bad guy, I'm right, you're wrong, and paint us as the hero in the story. So we want to just make it really super simple, put the argument into a vacuum, say, you are this way, you must be X, Y, and Z, and we skip all of the nuance in the middle. And none of these things are simple, right? All of this stuff that is happening, especially now, is more complicated, more connected than ever. But because we spend so much time in these echo chambers, it's causing people to drift further and further apart from each other.
Right.
And what I believe is going to happen is, if we continue to do this without some level of correction, this gap is going to get worse.
Yeah.
Right? These problems are going to get worse. And we as a society will spend more time arguing with each other to our own demise. Right? And all this stuff is going to go even further unchecked.
Yeah.
Because we're going to be so preoccupied trying to figure out who's right that we're all going to be wrong.
It's true. And this is where I think the concept of motivated reasoning is really important and often overlooked. And that is that as an issue comes up, sides are immediately formed, right? We're for this, we're against this. And some of the more interesting ones to me are, for instance, the debate on Ukraine, right? So Russia has been sort of an enemy of the United States for decades, for centuries almost. Now, on the right, there's this sort of move to sort of recast the group that's democratically elected, that wants to be Western, that wants to be part of NATO, that wants to break away from the sort of old Soviet heritage they're somehow the bad guy now, and the Russians who invaded them are the good guys, or I mean, it's not really clear. But what kind of a mental shift does that require? If you're a big consumer of that kind of media, because you were raised, on the sort of Red Scare and the Cold War. And now you're being told to kind of flip all of that upside down for no apparent reason. And many are seemingly willing to do that because of the kind of social pressure. And that's what I mean about motivated reasoning. It's sort of, you have a reason to hold the belief that has nothing to do with the merits of the argument. And that's something that we see in psychology all the time, that if you have a motive, like, if I'm hungry right now, I'm going to look for food. If I'm thirsty, I'm going to look for something to drink. If I am a racist, I'm going to look for certain things that kind of support that perspective. If I have a tendency toward disgust, like I tend to be disgusted by things. I'm disgusted by a lot of things, and I'm very disgusted by them. That alone is predictive of whether or not you're going to be a liberal or conservative. It also determines how harsh your judgments are. They've done experiments where they'll, like, put an unpleasant smell in a room and ask people to make, sort of jury-like decisions, and they become far harsher, in the presence of something disgusting. Uh, we are really just emotional beings. And on the left, it's not any different. If you don't like authority, you don't trust authority, you kind of have had issues with authority, you're far more likely to be on the left. And it comes from these things from our childhood or adolescence, sort of how we were raised, the things we were exposed to. And it's sad that, we're capable of so much complex thought and complex argumentation, and yet our positions seem to boil down to these incredibly emotional starting points, which I think are impossible to ignore, and the impact of them. And they are often ignored. And we treat everything as if we're actually having an argument about substance, when this has nothing to do with substance. It's just motivated reasoning.
Yeah. So my idea, and I'm curious your thoughts on this and how we can maybe sharpen this, because, and this is not a personal business venture so much as something that I believe society as a whole truly needs, was to take the news and essentially run it through an AI algorithm which can unbias it. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so to take it, remove the bias from the headline, and instead of just giving you an article, tell you what happened, why it matters, what the two sides of this possibly are, and give you a straw man and a steel man for both.
Yeah.
Okay, so to give you kind of a breakdown that you could read rationally without being emotionally manipulated by words or all the other stuff in it, no pictures, no drama, just give you the basic facts, give you a little bit of citation to where that actually came from so you can understand the perspective, right? Because there's always some level of bias. And I don't believe bias is bad. I believe bias is just everyone has their own perspective.
Sure.
But I do think it's important to understand what your perspective is. Hey, if I know what your bias is, I don't have to cast a judgment on if it's good or bad. I just understand from which vantage point you're looking at this issue, because it looks different to everybody.
Exactly.
And so to me, I thought, hey, if we can put together something that people can consume, that they can understand, hey, I can be informed without being outraged. Could we have intelligent conversations, and could we give people a little bit of better ammunition, if you will, to have these conversations without devolving into outrage?
Yeah, I feel like that's a very hopeful perspective, and I like it, and I find it very attractive. Knowing what I know about people's emotional beings and their behavior, and the fact that outrage drives the news cycle, outrage drives clicks and attention, it would be kind of going against human nature to try to get people to say, here's just the facts. Because the truth is, nobody wants, like, a great example of this comes out of behavioral economics. They did an experiment where there's a little girl named Rokia who's 7 years old, who's has malnutrition in some poor place, and they tell you her story and show her your picture and say how much you're willing to donate to help her. Then
Right.
the other condition is, there's millions of children in this country that are suffering terribly. There are, that they're deprived. How much are you willing to donate? Right? People are so much more likely to donate to the individual girl the picture because it activates their emotions. As soon as we begin rationality into it, it kills the emotions. They even tried a condition where they said, okay, you heard about Rokia. By the way, there's also millions of other people like her. That kills the emotions because all of a sudden you've taken you've kind of thrown, cold water on the emotions and said, this is now a statistical argument. Uh, that's how we're wired, unfortunately, to deal with information. If we respond to emotion, that's why we're drawn to emotion. That's why we keep coming back to things that outrage us, because it's inherently interesting. It's inherently invigorating. Facts without that are really what we need to survive as a species, to make like reasonable decisions for
Right.
long-term planning. We're just not wired for it. We're wired for immediate emotional outrage. And it's
So then,
maybe a question of our survival, really.
yeah, I do agree with you, and I think that's sort of the problem that we're in is outrage drives clicks, clicks drive dollars. So what are those people going to put out? Whatever it is that outrages you, and you're going to click on it because, again, we're stuck in that loop. I don't know that unless you remove the ability for those people to conduct business, which presents a whole other set of issues, I don't know that they're going to stop feeding you this outrage bait if you're going to keep clicking on it. Right. So to me, the only way I see to do this is for society as a whole to stop engaging in this, which obviously is tremendously difficult. But I wonder, like, how do we bridge that gap? Because, again, to me, if we zoom out a little bit,
Yeah.
I think we have to at some point stop
Yeah.
that from happening, because if we don't, it doesn't end well.
Yeah, exactly. And this is where it kind of loops all the way back to where we started. And I think there is a solution in understanding our emotional needs, which is sort of where we're really coming from, even if it's outside of our awareness. So we're not, it's subconscious largely. If we can understand where we're coming from, then we'll find a lot of interesting commonalities between us. People, on the right, who are big into outrage and disgust and all the rest, they tend to have a lot of, respect for things like authority and duty, what they would consider ethics and purpose, tradition, religion, institutions. People on the left would also sign up for things like social justice, doing right, righteousness. It is a certain point where it begins to come back together if you get right back down to the foundations and you stop with the particular manifestation in which politician associated themselves with it and what was the news story and who got behind it and who protested it in the public and who got arrested. Like if you strip away that stuff and get right back to the foundations, all of a sudden we have a lot more in common than we thought. And all of a sudden we can get around the outrage because we're starting from a common goal, which is I want people to feel a sense of autonomy. I want there to be a basic social contract. I want us to, as a society, not let corporations do things that are so much in their own interest that it's going to poison our planet and lead us to extinction. These are the things that I think we can all agree on, and we seem to just blow right past that and go right into the specifics because that's where the outrage lives, and that's where the
Yeah.
dollars are and the eyeballs. The truth is, if we can get back down to foundations, and really talk about, to me, I had another paper that basically showed that our values, what we consider our values, boils down to these 12 things also. Our values are, a value of safety, a value of personal authenticity, a value of, letting people reach their full potential, a value of material success. Those are values. And that conversation is essential, I think, at a very young age to say, okay, you come from a particular time and place. What are your values? What is your orientation in the world? What is desirable to you? And how would you trade these things off against each other? Then I think we can begin to have that conversation in a much more intelligent and productive way. Because we can't get into the specifics because there's way too much emotion. It's riddled with it.
Yeah. I think the image that I see when you say all that, and I agree with you, is sort of an attempt by society or whoever to define people into one or of two buckets. To say you're either left or right. You're either
Yes.
black or white. You're either whatever, right? Put people in two buckets, where it's probably more appropriate to give them 12 buckets,
Yes.
let them line up in those 12, but maybe they fall 5% to the right of center or 5% to the left of center,
Exactly.
right? Does that sort of make sense?
Absolutely. I mean, that's the key insight, I think, coming out of demography and political science, is that the center has fallen away because there's no constituency. There's no media outlet that targets the center because it's not outrageous. So what's happened is it's basically polarized society to these two ends, which are completely artificial. Again, to my point about values, they actually share a lot of the same values. They probably share almost all of the same values. There's probably some little, nuanced things about, if you're a committed liberal, you're probably willing to trade off a little personal autonomy for, social justice. Maybe more about purpose than you are about material success. That kind of thing, but it's on the edges. Everybody would agree that everyone has these 12 needs and we all want to fulfill them. But if we only talk about what divides us, which seems to be what is happening, it just sharpens those divides and makes them exaggerate their importance because we ignore the commonalities entirely. So you
Right.
need, I think one of my hopes for this model is to say, if we can agree that this is indeed the structure of reality, this is the deep structure, right? These are our needs as a human. We can measure them. We can then talk about the results. We can then build up from there without it turning into hysteria, and kind of start to try to create some debate based on those first principles, and say, okay, I understand as a Republican, you want to, drill, baby, drill, but what do you not care about, like, having a planet for the next generation? Like, is it just not a concern of yours? If you're a religious, person on the right, do you think that's what God would want? Do you think that's what Jesus would want? Like, we have to push these things to their logical conclusions, that these ideas don't exist in a vacuum. You have to make choices. You have to make trade-offs. And if we all want the same thing, then we can start to talk about what makes sense to trade off and to what degree and to what end.
Right. Yeah, because I mean, each one of those has a yeah, but attached to it, right? Because
Exactly.
there's always another condition that involves into another argument. And next thing you know, it's been 3 hours and we're just still arguing about the next thing 30 layers deep.
Exactly. And I think a huge piece of this is in the spiritual domain. And, and this is a thing where, liberals wouldn't like what I say, in that there is a sort of objective standard for justice. There's an objective standard for ethics. And there's almost an objective standard for a higher purpose that's built on justice and ethics. And if you don't have those and you don't teach those, you're not going to get them. If you, basically drop people into a world and say, you're free, just do whatever you want, there are no rules. There are no standards. There are no boundaries. They are not going to naturally create them for themselves. And I think you, ethics education, values education is something that's incredibly controversial because, again, people are starting from way down the road where all the sort of, structures have been built and politicians are involved and news is involved in media. If they could get back to the basics and say, these values, we believe in these values. I don't care if it's as an American or as a human or as a whatever, a living being, that we can subscribe to these values. And that's the starting point. And then it's a question of trading those things off against each other. It's not like you're painted with a brush, like, oh, you're a person who's only, self-domain and these people are only social domain, because that's not reality. The reality is we are all 12 all the time.
Yeah. So then how do we get back to that? Because, I mean, if the center is gone and eroding rapidly, like at some point we either need to just explode and start over or find a way to rebuild the center and get back to it. So, and that to me seems the question. And, part of it for me, now my views have a little expanded thanks to our conversation. But I do believe people have these four basic needs, and I'm sure you can put them into their proper buckets to feel loved, appreciated, seen, and heard. Right? That has been my personal definition of people's four basic needs, that they continually look for those feelings, right? And whether that's associating with an echo chamber because it makes them feel seen, or these basic things. And I think unless we start figuring out how do we mandate everyone to take this test and figure out what their 12 buckets are and how they align with those 12. I don't know how we start to get back to center.
Yeah. Well, I'm hopeful because we are doing this now in more and more schools. We have an opportunity possibly to expand that greatly through some partnerships. And I think if that's really the future is with the children, and what we teach them. And I really am a big believer in, training the trainers, training the teachers, training the administration and the parents, doing this with the parents and the kids, and basically using this as a way to, from a very early age, getting them to understand that these are the things that actually motivate us. These are the things that we need, the things that we strive for, and that all these other structures are built on top of it as a series of compromises between them. And that if we can begin to understand that, then all of a sudden, it kind of takes a lot of the wind out of the sort of aggressive, contrarian sails of like, of conflict. You can basically start to look at this and say, what is it that we hold dear here? What's the kind of core value in this context at this time that we need to pursue? Like if it's, preserving the planet, let's say, that's a pretty good one. That's a sort of a safety concern, right? If that's sort of fundamental and we're chipping away at that, I don't care how much, sort of, entertainment and casinos, whatever, distractions you can throw on top. If you don't have that, you got nothing, right? It's kind of like if you don't have your health, your other needs kind of fade away. And I think that's the kind of conversation we need to have, where we say, some of these things are more important than others, inherently. Some of them, once you've met them, you don't seem to think about them anymore because you kind of take them for granted. And that's actually a good thing. But don't ever think they weren't important. Like, don't disparage them because you now are not, immediately subject to their, the bad side right now. Like I can go outside and breathe and it's a nice day and all the rest. What if it weren't that way? What if it was, a toxic environment I lived in? And there were no fresh air, no clean water. All these other needs would just disappear, right? It's just survival then. And I think that's the kind of conversation that I think can happen. It can start at a young age, and it's tough. It's not all sunshine and roses and happy faces, but it's reality, and it's the real core reality that's sort of living underneath all these distractions that we're subject to.
Right. I think you bring up a great point, and it's one that I love to have this conversation as often as possible, because I look around at the parents of young kids. I've got young kids. My son is 11, my daughter is 8. And I look at how they interact with their friends. I look at the decisions that they make. I look at, hey, when you do something stupid, what do? Do you own up to it? Do you try and hide it? Little things, right? And to me, I often see that the decisions that they make tend to be related to the decisions that I show them. Right? I can't expect them to be something that they haven't seen before.
Yeah.
So for me to live my life out loud and show them, hey, this is what's going on. This is what mom and dad do. Right? They see an example of what they're supposed to follow. Now, to me, if they're in a spot where I say, hey, maybe you're not doing the right thing, I'm going to take a zoom out for a second and say, what example am I giving you? Maybe we didn't even talk about it, that you don't even know, so you just took a wild stab at it. But what I look at is this generation of parents, what generation of kids are they raising, and what's going to happen when those kids are parents? Right? Because if we don't now start having these conversations to say, hey, other parents, whether your kid is 0, not even born yet, whether your kid's 10 years old and you still got a fighting chance, like what standard are you setting for them?
Right.
And if all of us are arguing with each other, screaming at each other, and doing all this shenanigans, what hope do we have that these kids are going to grow up with an expectation of how to treat other humans?
Yeah.
Right. So I think it's imperative that we start having these conversations and show up as examples of, hey, how do we treat each other? And that's why I love having these conversations, because if it opens one person's mind to say, hey, maybe there's a better way, maybe I can take a step back and look at, hey, what are my 12 buckets? What are my priorities? How can I better consume information so that I'm not constantly being pushed to one side or the other, but I can find center even for myself. right? Then that can multiply out to their relationship, their family,
Yeah.
their workplace, right? How many places around them would start to feel that ripple effect
Yeah.
if we, for ourselves, take that step and just find center, find those 12 values, right? Our mix of what those mean to us.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I have a paper that I'm kind of putting the final touches on right now, which is another example of this, which is if you kind of have a myopic view of those 12, it can take you to some strange places. And I use the case of DEI, the sort of DEI initiatives, which, clearly came from a good place. They wanted, who would be against, feeling inclusion and belonging and having diversity, feeling a sense of equity. Nobody would be against that, right? But what they're actually doing is identifying a couple of our boxes in our matrix and saying, well, these are the ones that are important. It's saying, well, it's justice that's important, it's inclusion that's important, it's psychological safety, it's personal authenticity. That's what's important. Everything else, we're not going to concern ourselves with that. That immediately leads you to some strange places. Any overfixation on any of these needs to the exclusion of others produces an unbalanced result. And I think that's the sort of the heart of my message is that you can't ignore needs. Like all of these needs need to be taken seriously. Yes, it's complicated. Yes, it is a mouthful and a brainful to process. But we're trying to create ways to handle it that are more sequential, and you don't have to handle all of it at once. But kind of if you ignore a particular category of needs, it's going to be to your peril because they don't go away. I mean, Freud put it well. He's like, unmet emotional needs. He said you can bury them, but they come back to life. They're like zombies. They don't stop coming, and they will show up in ways you don't expect. So
Yeah.
take your needs seriously. Take society's needs seriously, and really start thinking about what is it that we're after, and forget all the slogans and the bumper stickers and memes and all the other sort of distractions, and get back to kind of really the core values that make us human. And then I think we can progress. So hopefully we will get there.
Yeah, I believe we will. I believe it's going to be a bumpy road, but there are people like you out there who are fighting the good fight and doing this. And I mean it very seriously.
Mm-hmm.
Like the risks that you're willing to take to go out there and be criticized. And I'm sure people make fun of you for having this belief and blah, 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 because it is what it is. But your willingness to stand up and do this research and have these conversations and help people find their version of center is what's going to cause that to be a reality one day, right? We're going to have that back to center moment where we realize, hey, we are all in this together, and we have to stop arguing about, right, which of the two buckets we fall in, and realize that like it's a little bit more complicated. But if we do it together, it could be a beautiful thing, man. It could be a beautiful symphony of life if we stop trying to argue about who's right and who's wrong.
Exactly.
And I do really appreciate you doing that work because I don't think it gets the honor that it deserves. And the end result of this, right? If we zoom out a few decades,
Yeah.
will be families that have totally different lives because of conversations like yours. And again, I just want to thank you for that. It means a lot.
Yeah, that's my pleasure. And it's interesting. I kind of at the beginning of my book, I start out talking about sort of my journey and how I came into this. And I actually did a lot of work in sort of, consumer research, marketing research. And one of my core principles that I try to start off with is saying, yeah, this is so important that there's a lot of people out there trying to monetize it. There's a lot of people who are trying to use your emotions and your emotional needs to sell more stuff to you and to distract you from what you really want and need. And that one of the key sort of bridges in life and sort of becoming your best self is to recognize what your needs really are and remove all of this distraction and the sort of glittering prizes and the stuff that kind of grabs your attention momentarily and leads you astray. And that to me, it's like that these insights need to be used for a non-commercial purpose. They have to be used for actually the betterment of society. or we're going to be in some serious trouble. It can't just be used to make a buck, in the short term, to meet,
Strongly
this
agree.
year's projections.
Yeah. No, I strongly agree.
Yeah.
Where can people follow up with you? Is there a place that people
Yeah,
can kind of learn their own needs?
absolutely.
What's the best next step?
So best place to go first, I would say, is just to go to agilebrain.com. So AgileBrain, you can take the assessment for free. Again, it's 3 minutes, just image based. It gives you an instant report. It collects something like 144 data points on you in those 3 minutes, and we have some algorithms and things that run in the background, and it can tell you sort of, okay, based on right now with this prompt that you were given, thinking about my current situation, here and now. I wish I could feel more of this. I wish I could feel less of that. And you'll get a profile of what those needs look like. For a lot of people, that's really a revelation because it's something that they've never experienced before. And it says, sort of, how did you get this? We hear this comment all the time. How did you know this about me? You really understand me. Why? How, how did you do that? It's like a magic trick. Then I think there's a lot of materials if you're kind of interested in the subject more deeply. We put all of my published papers, I think I've got like 14 of them now, on the site. So you can just grab them and read them if you like. They're a little technical, they're a little academic. If you want to kind of wade into this more gently, the book is great. The Emotionally Agile Brain, Mastering the 12 Emotional Needs That Drive Us. It's on Amazon. And we're actually having a big push to try to get it to number 1 bestseller on Tuesday, May 6th. So if you want to buy it that day, and that will help us achieve our goal. But yeah, no, it's there's a lot of resources available, and we like to put stuff out there and make it as accessible as possible, so as many people as possible will see it.
Good. I love that. Well, I will definitely support, and I'm actually probably going to go take that assessment literally right after we finish this. So
Awesome.
I'm curious to see how that goes.
That's great. Well, Jim, if you have any questions about it and you want to, discuss it, we do debriefs, and I'm happy to do one for you and kind of explain what the results mean. It'll tell you, but it always helps to talk to somebody. We also have new things. We have chatbots that have been developed, which will now, when you get your results, you can then ask the chatbot, which has been trained on my book and all the papers and everything else, what it means, and they can go very deep with you also. So there's
That's
a
awesome.
lot of cool stuff coming.
Yeah, I look forward to that.
Yeah.
Well, again, thank you. This has been a true pleasure, and I'm sure this won't be the last time we talk about it. Thank you.
All right, fantastic. Well, it's great to see you.